Can you hear me? Is it okay? First, I also want to thank.
You look like a musician player, you just start singing.
The machine stopped, so I know. That.
Never rely on technique.
Okay. So first, also very grateful for this new opportunity for exciting discussion. And you've seen this morning, beginning of this. This excitement comes because of what Erin and I intended to do, also from the high diversity of the people who are brought together. And that makes also a challenge to the audience and to the speakers, because the styles and the stuff can be very different. So I hope you will accept this difference of style in my talk. I could introduce it as a sort of close-up with relation to the remarkable and wide panorama that has been made previously by Hans Ulrich. I would like to present shortly and comment about some sort of intense discussion, both within the humanity and the social sciences in particular, and within our real world, some tension between claim for humanization and need for objectification or objectivation. This is just a part of the whole debate, ongoing debate about humanization or dehumanization. But it has been regularly relaunched, and I would like to comment about it, making a parallel between the way it is ongoing in the humanities and in the real world, and trying to develop a way to displace somehow this tension. So the first part would be about this objectified or allegedly reified human being in the humanities and social sciences. I would like to concentrate on the part of the story which comes from the attention paid to symbolic forms or symbolic coded forms, which is both very, in the Kantian tradition, both very present in the French sociological tradition through Durkheim and Mauss, and of course in the German Ernst Cassirer concern for symbolic form. And you know that there's been a dialogue between, a direct dialogue between both. This is a very, the issue of coded or symbolic form is a crucial issue for objectivation in the social sciences, and also the reason for some critical concern, critical position against dehumanization of this brought by the social sciences. As you know, in Durkheim and Mauss, the issue of this symbolic form is crucial to understand the building of collectivity, of communities. But of course you can find this notion at the very center of semiology, or rather semiologies, if you think of the difference between the French semiology as exemplified by Barthes, and the one by Luttmann in the Russian tradition. In that case too, codes or symbolic forms are a key issue to acknowledge, to build a science for humanities. Luhmann, of course, has put codification at the very center of his sociology, with the differentiation of codes, of systems of codes, and the tension between this universe of codes. Now let's go to the twist that Bourdieu has given to this tradition, excluding Luhmann, who, as you know, is very badly known in France, but I was thinking of Durkheim Cassirer, where, in the case of Bourdieu, what he has done with the significant consequences is to not only deal, or mainly not deal with symbolic forms as ways of building community, but as support for domination. So this is the twist that is given to the notion of symbolic form, so that, for instance, classification, codification are now stakes for struggles and stakes for domination, and not stakes for building culture. As a consequence of this entrance within humanities through this view of reproduction of inequalities through the domination of symbolic forms, there's been a reaction or a new trend or turns in the social sciences, in France in particular, which have been concerned by something like a rehumanization, if I can put it this way, through looking at the human agent or the human actor, otherwise than just as an agent of reproduction. So the concern in what has been so-called pragmatic turn, or although formerly interpretative turn, was to put at the center of the picture this human actor who was previously, as I mentioned, the receptacle, I don't know whether it exists, the support of these symbolic forms which were vehicles of domination. That meant a very strong shift, of course, in terms, as was just a moment ago mentioned, shift in terms of the definition of disciplines, philosophy, for instance, of Ricoeur was then brought back in the picture, but this rehumanization wasn't just a return to the subject. It was actually very deeply concerned by dependency of the human being on his/her environment. And here we find the kind of concern for ecological uncertainty that has been ongoing already in the discussion regularly with relation to what could be the quite open project of anthropology nowadays. I found it useful to remind you of, regarding this issue of the opening of the agent to the situation on the one hand, and some sort of closure on symbolic forms on the other. I found it useful to remind you of the harsh debate or criticism by Bourdieu of Sartre regarding the way Sartre dealt with the relation between this symbolic identification and the project of the subject. And I think it's very relevant for the ongoing project of humanities, which are necessarily concerned by this research on symbolic forms. It is highly relevant to look back at this debate. For those who don't have it in mind, it was concentrated on something that could be viewed as an anecdote, which is the way Sartre deals with the cafe waiter. In his being and nothingness. So regularly, Bourdieu, who had Sartre as his favorite enemy, as you know, went back to this issue of the case of this cafe waiter. What is the case? Well, in Sartre's view, Sartre is observing this cafe waiter when having his coffee, and of course this is one of the criticisms by Bourdieu, that his own fieldwork is to go in the cafe and observe cafe waiters. But if we drop this kick and look more seriously at the issue, then the issue is the following. Sartre considers that the way the cafe waiter, and you know that the French cafe waiter are especially expert in that, the way he's playing with a sort of automatic behavior is precisely the sign that he is not imprisoned in facticity or being in itself, in the term by Sartre, or alienated, but able to play with the identity, or to play with this symbolic form, which would be the role of the cafe waiter. So here the example is really a key example for Sartre's unfolding of his thesis. The need against bad faith of the possibility to express its freedom of choice, against the reduction to object. And of course, the reduction of object, reification, with this long question, long-going issue of reification in critical theory, the reduction to the chosification, thingness. Well, all these issues are involved in this case, where, by comparison and by contrast to Sartre's acknowledgement of this cafe waiter, Bourdieu considers then that the cafe waiter is not at all free to play with this role. but that he is somehow on the opposite by his body, espousing his function, his son poste, and that his uniform, his dress, habit en français, is inhabited by what you will call habitus. And of course, all this usage of the language of habit, habitus, habit, vest, is very relevant for the object that I would like to tackle, which is a way to displace this tension between human being and the objectification of forms. The displacement that I think useful is to, instead of going on with this position, and instead of just limiting the articulation between the identity and the being through the Sartrean notion of project, I think very useful to come back on the idea of investing, investiture, investment as the very basis of the way human beings can build confidence. Confidence in the possibility to communicate, to make things common, but also confidence in the way they can relate to themselves, correspond to themselves. And in that respect, vesting and as you know, the clothes was the elementary support for power in terms of the power to make things in common. Well, all this notion of uniform, before becoming a key issue of our contemporary society through standardization, certification, well, at the very beginning, this notion of vesting, investing is exactly the meaning of power. And nowadays, the displacement of the way where investment in forms are built from state power to a myriad of places where standards or a variety of other conventional forms are established. This displacement is at the center of the transformation of our contemporary world named globalization. Because globalization and the kind of interdependence that is assumed with this notion cannot be achieved without this huge deployment of this investment in coded forms. And here we find the place where the tension that I mentioned regarding the humanities is present in the human world itself. Because in reaction to forms of power and authority which have been criticized as hierarchical and authoritarian, there has been a significant transformation of forms of legitimate power and authority towards, as you know, an alleged horizontal authority of the individual as an autonomous person. And most of the contemporary policies, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, are informed and guided by this idea of an individual choosing with a sort of rehumanization of policies through this bringing to the fore of the capacity of the individual to choose. But the paradox of the situation is the fact that this apparent opening of the choice of the individual is going together with a huge deployment of these conventional forms, which are the basis of the possibility of this choosing or optional individual. So that even more than in the Taylorian or Fordist societies, we are living in a world filled with certification, standardization, qualification, most of them being non-visible, but absolutely needed for the kind of systemic interdependencies that are named globalization. So that we need, in our concern for the present that is guiding our common concern, reflection, we need to have an analysis relating the engagement of the human being and the establishment of these forms, which is not the kind of tension between humanization and objectification we have been accustomed to. This, and it will be my last concern, the last part of my talk, this is needed to develop a critical analysis of the way a new form of regulation or governing is nowadays developed, which I call governing by the objective or objective governing. I think this should be at the center of our concern for the shift of places of power. If we think of Bourdieu, you remember that he is considering that the state is the central bank of the cultural capital. Well, I think that this view is nowadays inadequate for two reasons. First, because the notion of capital is itself missing the relation of dependency on the human being with this framed environment or environment shaped in forms which I tried to grasp. And second, because the state is no more the place, the central bank for this kind of capitalization. All the places for the constructions of convention that are the condition of making equivalences and making global links, all these places are scattered and have to be brought to the public, whereas they are not at the very moment. And recent alleged catastrophes, as in the case, of course, of Japan, demonstrate the hidden part of all these chains of conventional connections, which are assumed as guarantee security, and which of course demonstrated are not being able of that. So that the present critical analysis should be dedicated to the kind of reduction through this objective governing that I mentioned. The reduction follows the three steps that I will mention as a conclusion. First, the variety of possible engagement of human beings with the world, with their two faces in terms which have been remarkably captured already by the pragmatists like Peirce, the face of the doubt and the face of the confidence. These two faces engagement or in investment with the world are reduced to one kind of engagement which I call the plan, where the capacity of the person is reduced to that of this willful agent, and the prepared environment is disposed in a functional state. This leads to cutting policies in general, or any kind of view of the common good, in little clear-cut objectives in the sense of plans, with the idea that these objectives can be also connected to objective measurement. So that the second step of the reduction, the first being to forget the face of doubt in the engagement with the world, the second phase is that of reducing the face of confidence to a measurement of properties. And this is the reason why all this huge development of qualification, certification are nowadays spreading, because the measurement of properties is thought of as a support for confidence within this reduction of the objective. And the price which is paid is both the elimination of other possibilities to consider more thoroughly the common concern or common good which are involved in policies, but also to oppress the kind of relation to the world which are not formatted in this engagement of the plan, and which are not reducible to properties attributed to things and persons. So, and this will be my conclusion. The tensions between the project of humanizing or bringing back the human against the background of the need of objectification, which is of course part of the project of social sciences on the model of science of nature. Well, this tension, which is both present within the recurrent terms of the humanities and within our contemporary world with the specific governing by the objective. Well, I think that this displacement of the tensions claims for rearrangement of the conception that we have of the relation between the human being or the human animal and her production of these forms. And I would like to observe as a final comment that if we remember the initial meaning of standard, it is not only an issue of uniformity. As you have guessed, my concern is not the criticism, the classical criticism of uniformity. We have to develop the criticism of objective, which is different from the classical criticism of objectivity, which brought social constructivism. Nowadays we need to criticize the specific governing by standard and the objective. And standard, if you remember, in English, is not only the name for something uniform, the idea that soldiers will be clothed with uniforms and that would ensure that they act as one, which is rarely the case during the battle, but more commonly the case when they march and not are in war. Well, we should remember that the standard, rather than being this project of uniformizing the world, is just the name of the stick where these soldiers, during the fierce action of the fire, will finally and very limitedly rally. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions? Comments? Zach?
I apologize, I wanted to manage not to ask the first question, but I promise it will happen once during the colloquium. My first question out of three goes back to what Jan Assmann was saying in an earlier discussion. When you talk about, so we can observe at the same time as a simultaneous movement towards globalization and a movement of differentiation. I mean, of growing awareness of identity of local culture and so forth and so forth. Now, how would you see that? Would you see that as a side effect, in a dialectic sense, saying whenever you have a movement towards larger, what we call globalization, it produces at the same time local differentiation? Or would you see it in the sense, I mean, that's a word that shows up in your title, as a tension? I mean, in the sense of insistence on locality being a resistance against moves of localization. So as we have to live more and more in the abstract, we want this local feeling of hominess. That's the first question. The second question refers to when you were talking, quoting Bourdieu, to the state as the bank of cultural capital. I don't know whether the metaphor was yours or Bourdieu's, but well, I'm sorry, I wish it was yours because it's so beautiful. I liked it a whole lot, so I always like metaphors to come from my friends. Yeah. Maybe you're wrong, maybe it's really yours. But, so I think something deeply changed. I mean, when the French state, or the German state for that matter, or the US, if one can say that, like 50 years ago was the bank of cultural capital, there was, continuing the metaphor, one currency. Yeah? And that currency in France was French culture. And although it was never defined, but it was very institutionally very clear what that was. French culture was what was taught at the lycée, at the école élémentaire, what was taught at the university and in the grandes écoles and so forth and so on. That was French culture, Comédie Française. Now today it's interesting, the German president, and the president in Germany is the equivalent of the Queen of England. So I mean, it's politically unimportant, but whatever he says is symbolically very important. Now the president of Germany said, Islam is part of German culture. What he said, Wolf said, Islam is ein zentraler Teil der deutschen of Germany. Well, but I mean, I think that's what he meant. He's not very differentiated terminologically. Okay, well, I'll say, make him say Islam is part of Germany. I think he meant it. The question is, would one say that if the state is the bank of cultural capital, this bank today has different currencies, so it has to deal with different currencies, and what would the consequences be? So does that bank has to transform then, for example, Islamic culture into German culture, or Tunisian culture into French culture, or would you say no, it is possible for the state being that bank to deal with different currencies? And the final question is not only a question regarding these two problems I try to pinpoint. So what you have given us was, I think, an impressive panorama of certain developments that are relevant for what we're talking about here, but I understood the question of the colloquium to be a question of organizing an epistemological situation, even within the university, organizing an institutional situation. So I haven't quite understood yet, and I did pay attention, did take many notes, what are the consequences for disciplines within the social sciences, within the humanities, that you would draw and propose as a consequence to your analysis?
Thank you. That could be a first answer to your first question, which would actually relate the two, globalization and differentiation, through the development of capitalism, because of course the kind of profit that result from all this chain of conventional establishment that lead to globalization, this profit cannot be fully developed. It was already an idea by, sorry, his name is missing. This profit is depending on the high tension between peculiarities. This is a relatively classical issue, but I think that we are observing nowadays at a larger scale this relation between possibilities of high equivalencies through very strong equipment and highly destructive opposition between particularities. So it's not only the result of a sort of resistance to globalization. It can be shown to be functional if you have this functionalist entrance. Now, second question, I think that and this is the reason why I insist upon this notion of governing by standards and objective. It is, as you know, no more an issue of nations. So that even the idea that the state should somehow make convertible a plurality of currencies wouldn't be an adequate metaphor. It would rather, the metaphor, if we stick to the idea of currency, would rather be the idea of a multiplicity of private currencies ongoing altogether, which is, by the way, things that we observe regularly also in the present world, and that we observed in some time in Russia. So that then the issue of the first, the power is not concentrated at all on a state and not related to a territory, which is, of course, as you know, the basis for the nation state. So I think that the differences are even stronger than the one you mentioned in terms of a plurality of currencies which should be made compatible. Then I think we need to go a step further. When I mention standards, actually I have in mind something much broader. If you think of the way young people communicate through these network technologies, of course there are standards that allow that. But apart from that, they communicate through, let me call this, commonplaces, with no disqualification of the term. They mention, and it is prepared usually in the software, they mention that in their profile the kind of music, film, etc. brand that they are attached to. So that is very close to their personal concern. This is the way they will expose their singularity with relation to the others. So this is the most singular part of their public exposition. But they do that through commonplaces which can be market, brand, but which can be also much more diverse. We could still call them symbolic forms, but which can be very concrete things, which are places where these people meet, but not in the sense that they share them, in the sense that they personally invest differently these commonplaces. I think this is the way these are used. So that, and it leads me to your third question. For the project of an anthropology of our contemporary, of our present, I think that we have to deal with this relation and an enlarged view of the notion of either form or commonplace, which is not restricted to what we called before symbols. You know, if you think of the piece of music, well, this is not a symbol. It can be just a sentence within the song, which is the place where people can meet. And when they meet, they do this through a highly personal investment of this commonplace, of this form. Well, my contention was that this engagement, this investment in these forms of which are used to guarantee some confidence in the relation to oneself and to the other, this should be a key part of our concern in a delineation of the project of anthropology. And in that sense, of course, anthropology is much wider than the former delineation of sociology with regard to the restricted form of communalization through society.
Any other questions? Okay.
I would like to make a comment about your last sentences. I think attaching himself in these social networks, for instance, is not a matter of differentiating himself, but rather enter a mass movement, leaving one's own loneliness. So if one person in this
living in the sense L-E-V-E.
Leaving, yes. People do not enter their interests in music, in film, in colors, in fashion to make a difference, but to join the network and to join a mass movement and actually to lose any differentiation, I would say.
Well, this is, I would say, the classical view of this uniformization. Sorry, I'm
I would say you are right, but the practice today, it's unfortunately not different from this. You should join these networks and look at these movements. You will find people with 900 friends, or 2,500 is the most you can have, and you can check what the music interests there are. They are not differentiated. It's a mass movement. It is completely the opposite of what you say.
May I have just a counter comment? I think that when we're speaking about globalization, we always stress this opposition of local and global. And local is a kind of, reaction towards globalization. And I think that's the most striking thing about the present situation, is the strengthening of horizontal ties. And what we're describing, somehow you are creating your own community, finding people who share your values or some kind of interests. And I think in this way it's rather unique. I don't want to say that never happened before, but in a way we can see these transnational ties which are going horizontally. It could be corporate, it could be professional, and all kinds of other things. And it's created a very sophisticated, way of looking at the world, and at differentiations. And in a way, when speaking about differences, we usually still think in national terms. That's being Russian is something very special, and being German is very special. But in a way, we can see in reality, in this horizontal world, we understand sitting here, each other much better than we understand our own culture. I mean, different social groups in a way. And so I think that's creates a kind of very strange picture, because we still think about ourselves in a kind of vertical world through national eyes. But in a way, that horizontal things just create an absolutely different type of world.
No. Maybe I agree with your point, but of course yours was much more pessimistic, and of course you are empirically, we can look at these processes which we've been doing, and of course it depends. So you are right, globally you can bring forward a very general trend of uniformization. But now if you look precisely through the relation to friends, using these techniques, well, then you'll see that even if the commonplace can be part of a limited repertoire, which is what you were stressing, even with this constraint, which is high, these human beings can express something personal through the commonplace. Now, it depends on the way you look at the process. If you look just at the commonplace as a cliché, of course you'll see just uniformity. Again, the classical entrance towards standardization. But if you look at the way the standard is implemented, it is true for the standard as it is true for the commonplace. Well then, the personal investment is there, and you can see the difference in what the person invests in the same commonplace, which has, by the way, is not then the same. So I think that I'm sure that the case of this highly equipped and marketized commonplaces would go rather in your direction, I agree. But I was mentioning that because it's also a place where a model of communalization through personal investing and personal possible differentiation is also at stake. Although, again, highly constrained by the fact that commonplaces are both highly marketized in that case and highly made publicized, which is another process of uniformization.
Just a little remark to continue on this. It's not by chance that you pick up the music or only one line from the whole narrative, because the narrative gives you the idea of standardization and the complete meaning. With the line or the music, you achieve this, what Mikhail Lemkhovsky defined as radical undeterminability. So you can find your subjectivity in this objectified, I don't know, media. And this is the problem. If you go on to the clothes or something that is much more objective, you cannot find what you defined as found subjectivity in the commonplace, I think.
I thank you for this comment, but I would pretend that it is really a way to deal with this relation, and not so much depending on what you delineate. And the example of the clothes is, I think, relevant. You cannot say that the clothes is too global to allow this personal investment. No, I don't think you can say that. The clothes can be...
Why are you looking at me?
I'm looking at you because of the journal that you have been developing on this topic. The clothes, and this is the reason why I'm going back to all this story of the clothing of the animal, which makes a human out of him, of her. Well, this story is loaded with the vocabulary of clothes, habit, habitude, habiter, inhabit, and it is relevant for what we say. One of the face is this. One of the face is this totalization, which looks like uniformization and which is needed for commonality. So it's not a drawback. One should not see the conventional face as something oppressing authenticity. It is the part of the same process that anthropology has to study.
Sorry for adding one more point.
No.
I think we have to deal here with nothing more than a tool. People express their clothes still on streets, on parties, on beaches, in public transportation, not in these networks. You cannot enter your clothes there. It's all prepared. You can enter your interests that are put into the network before by others. It's still growing, and I'm not that pessimistic, I'm not that optimistic as you, but I want to say when the TV came up, people found out that there are other hairs than the hairs of the parents, other clothes. So they responded to this in the public space. And today we have the same thing. But Facebook, for instance, is a place for completely disembodied communication. That's why you cannot differentiate yourself by clicking on some music which is put in by others, which is put in to finally find out what is your interest and what the industry can offer you to fulfill your interest, to buy. That's the point. And it's a kind of modification of what you said, but it is not pessimism. We should not overdo with these networks. It's a moment. Now it's very pressing on us, but it's a moment. It's such a moment as TV came up. People were crazy when they saw the Beatles.
No, but I agree with you. This is, of course, restricted mostly to communicating in the sense of making common through tools, which are not only language, by the way. So this is also something interesting. Now, maybe something that you dropped in your comment is the fact you said it is disembodied. This is not completely true because, as you know, the kind of publicity which is allowed by, let's say, blogs or things like that, this kind of publicity of the person allows for more appearance on the public of the intimacy. Now, again, I see your point, and I see what you have in mind, which would be restricted by these techniques. But you cannot say that the body or that the idea of virtuality, I think, is missing the fact that these techniques can change the building of the public space or the public communication, opening to more personalization, but through a high level of stylization, if you want to put it this way, through commonplaces.
Old-fashioned ways of writing letters doesn't mean it's also a disembodiment in a way, but we got used to it. But it depends what networks are entering, because there are quite a lot of pictures, photos, presenting yourself, your personality in a way. I think it's quite diverse.